So I'm very happy to introduce a panel who are global change makers themselves, and will speak on preparing students to affect change in the global policy-making world, and with some of their own reflections on the MPPGA program, because we have a current student and an alumni, and we'll definitely have time for questions from all of you at the end of the session. So we're going to welcome our Masters of Public Policy and Global Affairs second-year student, Keskine Owusu Poku, our MPPGA alumna, Corrine Ballmer, our MPPGA adjunct faculty, Whitman, and Linc Kessler, our UBC director of the First Nations House of Learning. And we are very fortunate to have Sheryl Lightfoot as our moderator, Associate Professor of First Nations and Indigenous Studies. So over to you, Sheryl, to try and wrangle these interesting people over the next few minutes.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the afternoon session. It's my pleasure to have all of you with us in the post-lunch era and talk about global change. So hopefully that will keep everyone excited and on the edge of your seat as you work through the afternoon slump. But I'm very pleased to have been invited to moderate this panel, and thank you very much for that invitation. And I want to just take a moment and offer my congratulations for this launching symposium, and wish the new policy school the very best. So thank you so much. And of course, I'll open the afternoon session by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam Nation, and as always, we thank them and acknowledge them for their ongoing support and friendship. And so with that, I'm going to invite each one of our panelists this afternoon to speak for about 12 minutes on the topic of their choice here. And then at the end of that time, I will facilitate questions coming from the audience and hopefully get a really good discussion going. So I'm going to invite our first speaker, Keskine Owusu. I knew I would mess it up. I got it right in the beginning, and then I said, when the mic's on, I'm going to mess it up. My apologies. Keskine will be our first speaker, and he's been asked to talk about becoming a global change maker. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Keskine.
Thank you very much. I hope you don't mind if I move it here. Yep. I'll start with a very quick disclaimer. Whatever I'm going to say is based on my personal experience. It may reflect that of my colleagues, but it's solely my experience and my observation since I got to UBC campus as an MPPGA student. I'll touch on 4 quick topics: why I chose UBC and MPPGA, my experience in class, that is with my professors and with my wonderful colleagues, the practical experience I got when I went to do my co-op with UBC Okanagan, and a few takeaways for the first-year students. Why did I choose UBC? UBC made a profound statement for itself, a place of mind. That is very much needed if we're going to be a policymaker. But I believe that in the 21st century, it moves beyond training the mind to training the heart. That is what it takes to be a global change maker. So it is very practical when you talk about public policy. People give fancy definitions of public policy. But I believe that public policy is the effect of everything we see around ourselves: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And since there is the bad and there's the ugly, it means that there's time for us to question some of the things that we believe in so much. Some things some years ago, we never valued them, but today it is the norm. We need to pursue change, and change is important. And that is the more reason why we are here as MPPGA students. And that is why we aspire to be global change makers. So what has been my experience in class and with my professors? I would describe my professors in just four sentences. You know, their resumes are very much enticing. When you see their resumes, you sometimes get scared. You know, but they are very nice to work with. They made enough time for us. That is during my first year, and I think my colleagues are also going to say a similar thing. This time we have fantastic professors as well, and they are doing a good job. About the expectations, you want to be a global change maker, already the expectation is very high. So it shouldn't be a surprise if your professors expect the same of you. They have very high expectations. And they're also very much accommodating. We bring subjects, there are times that we negotiate with them whether we want to write a paper or we want to write an exam. Because I believe this is grad school. So there should be that sort of flexibility, and they are very much accommodating. About my wonderful colleagues, I believe that they have been the greatest resource ever since I joined the program. The professor will guide you as to what you have to study. But going through the period, you spend a lot of time with your colleagues. You work with them in teams. And if you can't work with your colleagues in teams, how can you be a global change maker? You're going to work with people, and the best people that you can work with at the moment are going to be your colleagues. And they have been so, so fantastic. Policy is an action word. Research is important, but as much as practicable, being able to implement your research and your findings is key. And I believe research can be scientific, but it's also an art. The more you practice, the more you make perfect your skill. And that is where co-op is important. As first-year students, we learn a lot of principles, a lot of concepts, but co-op gives us the chance to put to practice what we learned within the first year. And I got that glorious opportunity when I got the chance to do a co-op with the UBC Okanagan campus, with the Health and Wellness Department, where we assess the UBC policies and how they are impacting the mental well-being of UBC students and the other campus residents. Many things came to the fore, and currently, based on that, and I was so proud that I was the only policy person among the numerous scientific and science professors I was working with. And at the end of the day, the findings that I made has now become the basis for a discussion around the table to change some of the UBC policies on the UBC Okanagan campus. And I think that is because I'm a global change maker. A few takeaways. I believe UBC offers more than just a classroom. If you want to be a global change maker, you have to be a leader. UBC offers more than just a classroom. We need to aspire beyond the classroom, join associations, join student bodies, attend seminars, attend workshops, if you really want to be a global change maker. And from my experience, I think that has been a very good thing. As a policy student, the very first time I got into the GSS Council, my impact was felt. Because we talk about policies over there, and I think I was the only real policy brain in there, as in coming from a policy school. Even though the others are so good, but you bring in that touch that a policy student can only add to the discussion. This is grad school. It's a place for deep assimilation of thoughts and not for accumulation of grades. So as a policy student, I believe the first years should think about it in this way. If you are in high school and you copy from a friend, it is called stealing. But if you do that in grad school, it's called cooperation. You learn from each other. It's not a competition, no. It's about learning how to work with people, because that is how the real world out there is like. Again, as a policymaker, I believe we should appreciate that we know nothing, because policy is very local. There are times I took reports from IMF and other international organizations. I read it and I asked myself, do they really know what they wrote? Because they wrote about my country, wrote about my people, and I felt they didn't understand it. Policy is local. And you get to learn more when you engage with people, especially people within the localities. One other thing that I believe the first years may want to learn, and I'm still learning about that, is that the person sitting next to you in class might end up being the best resource ever you're going to have. I learned so much from my colleagues because they came from diverse backgrounds. There are times that I had to question some of the norms I believed in because some of my colleagues challenged me to think about those. They've been the best so far. And if you're going to learn, there is no other better person to learn from than your colleague. And we should value friendship and networks. And I think they've been so great in that regard. But I end by saying that you want to be a global change maker, train not only the mind, but train your heart as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keskine, and thank you for your remarks. And next we'll go to a very recent alum of the program, Corrine Ballmer. So 12 minutes, please.
It's probably not going to be 12 minutes, but that's because I've only been an alumni for 4.5 months. Graduated in May. I don't feel like I have enough experience out in the world as a real policymaker yet to go on for 12 minutes. So I will reflect on the program, being in the first cohort, and some of the things that it provides its students with that they may not realize are as important until they leave, and some of the things that the program can't provide, that you only gain after you've graduated. So first off, I want to echo what Keskine said. As a policymaker, you know nothing about so many experiences. If you've made it into this program, it is a global program, but no matter how many countries you check off on your big map of where the students come from, if you can afford to get into this program, you're not going to be like so many of the people you create policies for. So many of those people live in experiences you haven't experienced because we're all so individual. Our lives are all filled with experiences that make us who we are and make us so different. So one of the great things about this program is you get to enter a classroom with, for us it was 15, for you guys 25, now it's 41, people who are coming to this place because they share the desire to make change. And everyone has their own issues that really stir their hearts, but we all come from different backgrounds. And so when you leave not only with the skills your professors taught you, the connections you made through networking and through your co-op, but also with the voices of, for me 15, for you guys 25, people who come from such different places and who bring so much to the table. You leave with 15 other perspectives on every single policy problem you talked about. Because trust me, there's not a lot of agreement on a lot of things that need to get done. We're all really different. And I felt that particularly because I was the only student with a humanities background that came into our program. Everyone else had some sort of social science or economics background. There's me, haven't done math since grade 11, and coming in and saying, what about the people? What about the stakeholders? How do we talk to them? How do you listen? And I think the program provides such a great opportunity for learning to listen. You're sitting in that classroom, your professor's speaking, but so many of our professors encourage open dialogue. And so when you're actually arguing about what to do about the refugee migration, if you were in Greece, so many different perspectives, and if you're learning to listen to what other people are saying and what they're bringing to the table, that is a huge skill set for when you leave. Being able to walk into a room or a meeting or any engagement and listen to other people, because everyone's lived experiences matter. If someone has taken their time to come to a stakeholder engagement meeting, it's because they're giving something up. Every moment you spend engaging with policy, if you're not being paid for it, you're giving something up. Economics taught me that. And so when you're coming into those meetings, you have to listen to everyone who's there because their voices do matter. And even though they may say things that you weren't expecting or things that you don't really have a solution for or you didn't really think about, it's still really, really valuable. And that the program sets you up for that really well by forcing collaborative dialogue, group projects, and co-op experiences. The thing that the program provides the most, though, is confidence. You've experienced first year, which is a roller coaster of classes, getting to know everyone, being thrown into disciplines because it's so interdisciplinary. You probably haven't worked in for maybe ever, maybe 2, sometimes 10 years out of a discipline, and you're thrown back into it at a graduate level. So if you can get through that, and then you can get through your co-op, and then you can get through second year, which is even more crazy and involves a capstone project where you get to work on a real policy problem it's affecting the lives of hundreds of people around the world and work with a client, you can hack it in the real world. And so to have that confidence behind you when you do leave is so essential. Because confidence may seem like sometimes it's a personality trait, but for most of us, it's something that comes from experience. Okay, I did that, so this can happen. Okay, managed to climb that mountain, so I can climb this one. That sort of thing. When I left this program, I took a lot of time off. I'm still taking time off. I'm traveling. I have wonderful experiences that I'm enjoying right now. And so many of my colleagues are involved in amazing projects around the world. They're working in Ecuador, Mexico. They're working in Myanmar. And so many of them are local. The networking experiences you have through this program, it means that I can call people in the federal government, the municipal government, and the provincial government and have someone to talk to because I've met someone through this program. It provides a lot of experiences, but most of all, it provides a cohort of people you can always turn to, people you can trust, and professors you can call at any time. It's a great resource. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Corrin. And now we'll turn the mic over to our faculty member, adjunct faculty member, Ann Whitman, who is going to talk about how the MPPGA prepares global change makers. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here today at the official launch of the UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. A generation ago, when I was in university, we students were asking ourselves if the end of the Cold War was in fact the end of history, as some were suggesting at the time. Today, as the world faces challenges on every front, economic, environmental, social, political, with no obvious solutions in sight, and instead competing visions and even alternative facts, we might be tempted to wonder if it is the end of certainty. Climate change, mass migration, economic dislocation, nuclear proliferation are just a few of the problems facing us. Although many of these problems are truly global in nature, our existing institutions and our politics have not found ways of adequately addressing them. Some scholars call this gap between our shared global problems and the lack of shared global solutions as a governance gap, but it is real people who fall through the cracks. Refugees who drown because they put their lives in the hands of human smugglers because there's no institution to take them to safety. Workers in the developing world who suffer injury and death, who are not protected by local health and safety laws, nor by the multinational companies whose supply chains they're part of. The problem with these issues is not really that there's no one to blame, but that there's no one to hold accountable. In the MPPGA program, we don't think one discipline has all the answers to the many problems facing the world today. Instead, economics, politics, history, law, science are all relevant for understanding our present and for helping to shape our future. We aim to teach students to draw on a range of disciplines in order to come up with creative and innovative approaches to public policy challenges. In this regard, we are very fortunate, as those of you who are students here know, that the school has an impressive and diverse faculty. Some professors have devoted their professional lives to research, writing, and teaching on particular areas. Others have spent time in the public sector or private sector, and some have done all three. They have expertise in a wide range of fields, from nuclear physics to transitional justice to disaster management to Chinese history to environmental law to digital technology to microeconomics. There is also, as you know, an incredibly diverse student body with students from Canada, Ecuador, China, Kazakhstan, Congo, and the US, to name just a few, with backgrounds that include the tech sector, social justice, engineering, and communications. This means, as Keskine was saying, the students can learn as much from each other as from the faculty about examining thorny policy issues from different perspectives. There's a strong emphasis on helping students translate ideas into practice. In addition to the co-op placements, the capstone course or global public policy project is a chance for students to work directly with a client to solve a current and real-life policy problem. Last year, one group spent the academic year studying and doing field work on the Indian government's financial inclusion policies and wrote a comprehensive policy report for a social enterprise firm that was their client. We aim to prepare students for the, quote, real world, but also to be critical of it. Many established institutions, whether they be governments, corporations, or intergovernmental agencies, can be hidebound by particular ways of doing things or wedded to certain assumptions. To put it another way, the generals are often fighting the last war of the previous generation. And we're aware our students may end up working for some of these generals. We teach our students to think critically and independently and to be grounded by different intellectual traditions as well as their own values. Our aim is to give the students the tools they need to develop their ideas and careers with creativity, knowledge, and integrity. We believe the world needs their ideas. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne. And final panelist this afternoon is Linc Kessler, who is my colleague in First Nations Indigenous Studies and is the director of the First Nations House of Learning, or the Longhouse as we call it in colloquial terms here at UBC, and also the senior advisor to the university president on Indigenous affairs. So, Linc, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first I want to thank the panelists who've spoken already for, I really appreciated everything that you had to say, and I hope I can come close to the articulation with which each of you said it. It's very clear in listening to the comments already today, and I'm sure to ones that you've heard earlier, that the school really represents an opportunity for people from many different backgrounds to get together and to share their views on the formation of policy. And so I'm assuming from what I've heard that cross-cultural interactions are part of everything that the school does, and that thinking about relations in a global context is very key to its operation. In my few minutes to share with you, I really want to concentrate on one particular kind of interaction, and that's the interaction of the school as an institution with Indigenous people. And this is, in my current role, I mainly do strategic planning across the university for interactions with Indigenous people and programs. And I want to begin by just talking very quickly about the time when I first came to UBC in 2003. And my role at that time was to be the first director of the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program and to establish the curriculum in that program. And the first groups of students I had in that program were all Indigenous people who had been waiting for this program to be available. So they were a bit older than average. They were quite militant in their stance, political stance, and they were very concerned about the nature of the curriculum that we would develop. One of the things that characterized them was a profound degree of circumspection about the education they would encounter here at the university. And that was confirmed by many of the interactions they had in classes outside of our program, where they encountered approaches to thinking about Indigenous people that were inimical to their experience, and they felt quite prejudicial to their circumstances. That should not surprise us, and it certainly didn't surprise me. And their circumspection did not either. Next spring we will be opening on campus the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. It's the new building being constructed in front of the Corrine Library. And it will provide access to the records of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which documented the 100-year history of the Indian residential schools, in which Indigenous children were taken from their communities forcibly and relocated to the schools where they encountered very substantial forms of abuse and received a very minimal level of education. That's a national history which we have inherited, but within communities it has led to a very profound circumspection regarding institutions of education and what their aims were. And for my students, when they came to the university, they were interested in acquiring a higher education, But it wasn't necessarily that their interest was in acquiring the education which everyone else was taking for granted as being the education that had value. They were very uncertain whether that would be the case. And that has led me to a conclusion which I offer to you, and that is when we're thinking about the inclusion of Indigenous people in education, access is not enough. Because the question is access to what? And whether the education that we are providing access to is one that really addresses their needs, but also recognizes their history and the circumstances of their communities with respect to the larger society. And that is a much bigger question. I remember the discussions at the formation of the policy school. The main form of interaction with Indigenous people was in granting access, creating some seats that would allow Indigenous students to come into the program. And that question of access to what was much harder to address. And I would like to offer this thought, that part of what we are attempting to do with the center that I mentioned is not simply to rehearse a very sad part of Canadian history, but provide a way for people to see each other and understand each other, and then with that knowledge have a basis to talk to each other in an informed and meaningful way. One of the consequences of Canadian policy, and this may be true in many other areas in the world as well, is that there has been a real suppression of information about Indigenous people in Canada. Until really into this century, there has been no meaningful curriculum in the educational system that would prepare people to understand Indigenous issues or the circumstances of Indigenous people or what their history has been. And that has created a situation in which when people later, after their formal education has finished, find themselves in circumstances where they're negotiating with Indigenous communities or people, they are talking with people who they know very little about. On the other side, as Indigenous people encounter others who come in to talk to them, they're aware of the fact that the assumptions that those people are making are not accurate, and that in every aspect of that interaction, their actual circumstances are being overwritten by assumptions which have no basis in fact. And that is simply because we never developed a way to talk about those things. With knowledge, with understanding of the actual history of what has happened in this country, we open up a real window of opportunity. And the window of opportunity is that we come into the same conversation understanding something shared about what has happened in our country or in other countries where similar circumstances have transpired. And with that knowledge, we are better able to begin to have interactions in which we have the capability of talking to each other directly and in meaningful ways. And that is a phenomenal value. So that is, in a sense, I think a challenge that lies before us, not just in this school, although I think it has particular importance here, but really in all aspects of the education that we offer to all of those who come through our universities. This is, I think, really important because if we do not address that deficit in knowledge, which has been our inheritance from previous generations, and if we do not find ways of understanding history and the circumstances that everyone faces that are so different, we have no way to talk about them that is productive. And in the absence of that, we replicate the habits of the past and in conflictual environments in which there is very little way to move towards effective solutions. I come out of a very traditional academic background. Before my current role, I taught English literature for 20 years. I was at one time somewhat of an expert in early modern literature. And that's a discipline that began historically in the end of the 17th century, which means there have been several hundred years of people thinking about that subject and developing a very adequate way to think about it and to talk about it. and to extend their knowledge with every passing year. In this area, we come out of just the opposite. We come out of years of suppression of the ability to form ways of talking that will serve us well. And that is a task that lies before us, but it's a task of really significant opportunity, and particularly in a school of policy, where the need to have informed discussions and ability to work with each other to form policies that are meaningful and effective is ever present. So I think there is a real opportunity for this school to do something significant if it is willing to understand the complexity of this challenge and apply to it the same kind of ingenuity and depth of thought that it is obviously placing in so many other areas. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Linc, and thank you to all the other panelists for your opening thoughts. And I'm just going to take a moment of autobiography to reflect on what I've heard today. I got a master's in public policy many, many years ago, and I'm not going to mention the year because that'll give away too many things that I don't wish to give away right now, but let's just say it was at least a generation ago. And that I did a MA in public policy, okay, it was the 90s, and did one career after that, and then came back to PhD mid-career and did political science and my current work on Indigenous rights and politics on the global level as a mid-career move. So I'm listening to the students and the recent alums, and I'm getting a little bit of flashback about first year, second year, microeconomics, macroeconomics, having to take math again when I hadn't opened a math book since high school. All of that came right back, and so I join you in solidarity and applaud the interdisciplinary approach, because I'm really happy to see that that is still challenging students and giving you a really strong skill set to take forward in the world. And so I'm with you, and I just really challenge you to keep going and deal with the math and the economics and bring all of your humanities. I think it's a fantastic beginning education for a career in public policy. And of course, coming all the way through the panel, what Linc was saying, I reflected on that as well, because when I got my MA in public policy in the early 90s, there was no Indigenous content or Indigenous engagement in that program whatsoever. And the surprising part about that was it was located in the city of Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota, which is one of the highest population proportions of American Indian people in the United States in an urban area. So it's surprising that we were going to talk about public policy and train students for public policy when it was absent from the education. So I am absolutely delighted, thrilled, and encouraged that a generation plus forward that we are having these conversations and that there's a door open that there wasn't at that point in time. So again, I applaud you for opening some very difficult conversations, and at a moment where change is happening, both locally, nationally, globally, and Indigenous issues in these conversations really do just need to be part of the project. So with that, I'm going to open up the Q&A, if I may, and invite my panelists to reflect on what you mean by global change. What are the problems that you see that are most priority locally, nationally, globally, and what are your aspirations for global change? You've talked about where you're coming from and the tools that you have, but what are your dreams? What are your aspirations? What do you hope to achieve? And I guess I'm looking particularly at the students and the alum to answer that question, but I'd just love to hear your perspective and your reflections.
You can go first.
Thank you very much. Aspirations. I think I have a lot of aspirations, but judging from where I'm coming from, I think I've seen a lot of poverty already. Having grown from not so well-to-do home, haven't, had the education, gone through the whole cycle. It's by some sort of miracle grace that I got to this extent. But I believe that, looking back to Africa, looking back to Ghana, I believe policy is not the solution in its entirety. It's part of the solution. But one major thing is leadership. And I'm interested in politics. In fact, I was in politics before I came back to school. I believe to be a good politician, to be a good change maker in the sense of a leader, you need to understand public policy. You need to know where to put the A's and put the B's before you can make a change. And I hope that someday, sometime, after this program, when I get back, I'll be able to affect some of the policies they make, some of the decisions, do a lot of research, write papers and all that, tackle the debates and make sure we talk about some of the very important things that we've never given ourselves a chance to talk about. And I hope that someday, sometime, that can affect the whole development discourse back home in Ghana from a policy perspective and also from the perspective of a politician. I don't know if I've done justice to your question, but that is one aspect of the whole aspiration that I have. The other sense of it is what I study at the moment. My stream is governance and security. I hear a lot of people talking about security from the point of arms, conflict and all that, but there is a genesis to it. When there is poverty, when there is youth unemployment, when there is underdevelopment, it has a boomerang effect. So security and all these things are coterminous, they go together, right? So I hope to learn more from a governance perspective, how to make the good decisions so that I can tackle issues of poverty, underdevelopment, and all that before it escalates to those issues of combat and conflict. That is my point of how I want to attack the whole concept of security. Be very proactive and not reactive, because I believe the world today is more reactive than being proactive. Thank you.
So the question is aspirations, right? Okay, I aspire to be someone who's trustworthy. When Kim Baird was speaking earlier, afterwards I asked her, how do you walk into a room and have a negotiation with a government that represents a colonial history that is so painful? How do you interact in a way when there isn't potentially trust as a basis between the relationships? I think that I aspire to make sure my decisions are based on fact that I have at the time, that they have evaluation processes associated with them, and that over time I aspire to be someone who made an impact so that other people can raise their children in a way so that they are healthy and happy and have opportunities. And I'm a Vancouverite, I'm fifth generation Vancouverite. This is my home. I aspire to this city to make a difference on the problems that really matter to us, because there's so many different people living in this beautiful, beautiful place, and so many people who want to live here. People who are having problems living here, and people who will live here in the future. I aspire to make this city, and by extension, the world, because we are such a connected world, a place filled with people who are happier and feel more secure when they're able to walk down the street and interact with one another.
Sure. I wasn't expecting to answer a question on my aspirations. Well, I think, I guess, one of the things the students have to wrestle with is whether they agree with Max Weber, the German sociologist who said politics is the art of the possible, or they agree with Václav Havel, who was the first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia, who said politics is the art of the impossible. I think politics is probably both, to be fair. to do it right, to do policy right, you have to be creative, you have to be innovative, but you also have to be pragmatic. So every person will approach that question slightly differently depending on their own personal values and the particular problem in front of them, but that's the kind of sort of question I would ask my students to consider for themselves, where they see themselves on that spectrum.
I'll be in trouble later.
Well, to some extent, I think I have some long-range aspirations, but I have some quite short-range aspirations. I think we have a real opportunity here at the university through this school, but through many other places in the university to really affect a fundamental change in the way we prepare people for their interactions in a greater society and their roles as professionals that others will be looking to for important functions, but also for leadership. And I think in the area in which I'm working, the time to affect a change is now, but the potential to actually do that is very, very high, because we are at a time in which we can begin to develop the things that history has not provided for us, and if we do that, it will make a very substantial difference. So I'm quite hopeful about that. It's maintaining hope for me has been key to my professional life, because it's often been very difficult, but it's been important to do it, and I think it's been important just to my survival as in any sense. So I think we can do these things. I hope that you find them compelling and interesting, because I think we can only do them if we do them together. But that can happen, and it would be certainly something we could all look back on with some pride for every little piece of it.
Thanks, Linc, and please forgive me for putting you on the spot.
That's all right. Everybody else does.
I'm an academic, and academics are notoriously long-winded, and this is probably the first panel in my life that has run under time. But the advantage to that is that we have plenty of time on the schedule for audience interaction and questions. So at this point, I'd like to open that up and invite discussion, conversation on any of these points from all of you.
Hi, my name is Andrea Wong, and I've been, I have a microphone. My name is Andrea, and I've been a public servant with the Government of Canada for over 13 years now. I'm currently with Environment and Climate Change Canada here in Vancouver. Before that, I worked on trade policy and negotiation issues in Ottawa. I would like to congratulate everyone on the launch of this school and being here today, and make a couple observations that really struck me during the panel discussion. The first of it is on Indigenous affairs. And I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone here for me to reiterate that the current government of Canada has made reconciliation with Indigenous people one of their most important priorities, and renewing the nation-to-nation relationship is of primary concern. So what this means for us as public servants, though, is that we're currently in a little bit of a new world where Indigenous relations is not a separate discipline. That what we are working at right now is to integrate Indigenous perspectives into all of our files. So there is no longer a file that does not have an Indigenous dimension. We need to consider the Indigenous perspective in all of our work. So I would invite you to, as students in going through your program, to keep that in mind as well. You know, even if you're working on something that may seem to be internationally focused, or your interests are in diplomacy, to come back to that question of how it impacts Indigenous people and what are the Indigenous perspectives. The second observation I'd like to make is related to this idea of aspirations and what you what you hope to accomplish afterwards and sort of career directions. And earlier this year, I was at a policy conference in Ottawa for policy professionals. And during his remarks, the clerk of the Privy Council said, policy analysts and policy professionals don't make policy. They implement policy. Politicians make policy. So, you know, and it comes back to some of the things that you were saying about politics and leadership. So I would also invite you, as you move through your studies and planning your career, to think about what role is appropriate for you. Is it as an implementer of policy, in which case going into government functioning is where you're going to be able to affect that kind of change? Is it setting policy, in which case you need to go into politics? Or is it influencing policy, in which case academia or the civil sector is where you're most likely to have influence? So again, I congratulate everyone, and I know that you have exciting times ahead of you in this program.
I wouldn't mind saying a few words on that one, and a couple of aspects of it, actually. One of them is it's good to hear that the government is taking an approach where Indian affairs or Indigenous affairs are not confined to a single department, but really are integrated across portfolios, because I think that accurately reflects the reality that those relationships exist in all of those areas. The government and many others use the term reconciliation, and to me, I have difficulty with that term, because it posits a kind of an end state where everything is somewhat okay. Maybe I'm going to see that. I'm getting to be kind of an old guy, so maybe I'm going to see that, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. What I like to see is better, more functional. And I think that's something that I think we can get to. I think we can get to more functional. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody likes each other or that everyone is satisfied with every aspect of the outcome, but it does mean that we can do it better. And I think there's a really high value in that. The other thing I think you raised such a great point about implementation versus direction, the forming of policy and the execution of policy. And the one thing I would add to that is that people can form policy or form implementation strategies, and I think in my little limited role in the university, I do both of those things, but they can only do what they can imagine. And part of the question is, what are the constraints in our imagination? And in my previous academic career, one of the questions that I asked or was working with quite a lot is, to what extent is the language that we use a constraint on our ability to imagine things? And if we can't see them, if we can't imagine them, we can't work towards them, either through devising policy or through devising means of implementation. So the language which is available to us is really important, and the ways in which we're able to think about and describe things is really important in what it allows us to generate as policy and implementation. And that's where I think it's really important that we keep in mind both what we're able to talk about, but also the things that we have difficulty talking about because we don't have the language to work towards them.
And I'm going to step out of my role as moderator for just a second and add on to this and also respond to the audience point. And since I have a policy-minded audience, I'm going to take a moment and say, even before the new government came in, that earlier that year we had the announcement of the summary report and final report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was released in June 2015. And that commission included in its report 94 calls to action, which I'm sure you've all heard about at some point or another. Those 94 calls are for each and every one of us to rewrite, to redo, and to reimagine how we live together in this society. And that Truth and Reconciliation Commission based its recommendations, the foundation of those 94 calls to action is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which just had its 10th birthday yesterday. So we're entering a new era of thinking, designing, governing, living, and policy. So if you haven't done so already, I invite each and every one of you, whether you're new to Canada, whether you've been here for a long time, whether you've been here for 12,000 years, go online, read the summary report, get familiar with the 94 calls to action because they are incredibly comprehensive and they deal with everything from educational institutions to local government to national government to global institutions. It's widespread, it's broad, it's deep, and I invite everyone to be familiar and read those 94 calls to action. And then read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which lays out very clearly the guiding framework for how states and Indigenous peoples should be living and working together. So as policy people with all of these big goals in mind, I invite you to come home at the same time and keep those change and those transformative movements and directions in the forefront of our minds as we move forward into the world.
I guess I can use this mic. Two questions. One to Anne. Anne, I really want you to talk about your career because there's a reason why Anne teaches in this program. We value our academic input to this program, but for students, we need people who actually have made policy, translated, been there. And so just a little bit of a bio on some of the highlights. So that's question one. The other question is for Linc and Sheryl. So I like to act. I like to do things. So I would like us to make some first steps in this program to do exactly what you suggested, which was doing the integration of Indigenous issues into our curriculum. And we can do that more quickly than we can take stuff through Senate, right, Linc? In the sense that eventually I think we need to sit down and talk about how is the policy school, how is the program going to step up to the opportunities that exist for us around all the Indigenous policy issues that surround us. So that's a bigger question. But, we've got a UBC strategic plan underway right now. That's an opportunity for us from a kind of resourcing standpoint as well as a policy standpoint. But I'd be interested in your comments on, how could we be creative of this term and next term making sure that our new cohort of students and our second-year students are really getting those challenges presented to them. And maybe Anne is one venue for that happening. Anyway, so two questions. Anne first.
Well, thank you very much. Oh dear, my background. My CV is either very confused or very strategic, depending on your point of view. I started out in law and did a sort of standard commercial law for a couple of years, and then moved on to what might be called international human rights or rule of law work. I was interested in international work and found that a Canadian law degree was enough to take you around the world getting jobs in various places. So because this was the late 90s, early 2000s, the jobs were in the Balkans. So I stayed in the Balkans for about 4 years doing different jobs in Bosnia and Kosovo with titles like rule of law officer, legal officer, this sort of stuff. And it was very interesting, needless to say. I then went to the UK and did some graduate work and slowly wound my way back home. And the first job I had when I came back to Canada was in the responsible investment field, which was a new field for me, but it was quite neat because it combined kind of global human rights issues in a way and commercial realities, which I was familiar with from my legal training. So it was looking at the corporate sector from the point of view of big institutional investors like pension funds who want to, make sure the companies they're investing in are sustainable so that there's actually a pension fund in 20 years, and also because they want the companies to be doing certain environmental and social governance practices. So I'm not sure there's a clear line with all of that, but it's a mixture of law, human rights, and long-standing interest in the corporate sector and what the corporate sector has to offer us and where maybe it needs to be criticized.
Okay, what do we do quickly? Well, but quickly.
Well, one thing I would say is that it has never been, I've been doing the work in this area for quite a long time. I've never waited for a grant. I've never waited for an institutional directive because it's just not acceptable to think in those kind of time frames, and it makes it very difficult to do the work. There is always a matter of resources, and there's always a matter of money, but the real issue is developing competence and knowledge, and that is not always a matter of resources. It's mainly a matter of attention and a recognition. One of the things that we have to recognize is that until recently, the absence of information, for instance, on Indigenous issues in our education system has meant that we have a generation of scholars and professors here at the university who know a huge amount about all kinds of things and almost nothing about this thing, unless they happen to be from that background or have taken it on as a particular object of study. When I came through university, which was many, many years ago, there were no courses in American Indian anything. I returned to the Yale University where I got my undergraduate degree, actually to get an Indigenous Alumni Award. I guess there were so few of us that eventually was my turn. 45 years after I graduated, and actually I was the first graduate to receive that award. I think the rest were from divinity school and law school. But in any event, not that much had changed. And I found that really quite disturbing. And I think things are changing here at UBC. We have more people joining us who are expert. Sheryl is certainly one of them. But we also have many faculty members now who are recognizing that the path of their professional development has not given them the tools to enter into meaningful discussion about these matters. And they're taking the time and investing the energy in developing some competence to work with those tools. There are specific ways in which we can do that, and I would be happy to speak further with you about them. But I don't think there's a reason to wait. I think there's a reason to analyze and put together a plan to make that kind of a change.
I'm just going to extend that with a couple thoughts. And in dealing with non-Indigenous academics and professors, I think I've identified one major stumbling block, which everyone can deal with immediately. And it's a very short word. It's fear. There's tremendous fear among non-Indigenous professors about saying the wrong thing, doing something offensive, getting it wrong. And as a consequence, people avoid the topic completely. And I think in terms of integration of Indigenous issues into the curriculum throughout the university, we have to deal first with fear. And we have to and we deal with this in every single one of our classes early on because, and I notice this every term begins, the first class is so quiet. Second class is so quiet. because no one wants to offend anyone. So it's coming from a good heart, and it's coming from a place of good intention, but the outcome makes nothing, because we're not able to engage and we're not able to have the difficult conversations. So one of the first things that we've learned to do in the classroom is talk about how to have difficult conversations, how to talk about things where we're not sure we're getting the vocabulary right, how we can engage as good-intentioned people in issues that we don't have the discourse, we don't have the language, and we are so very afraid. So the first thing I do is invite everyone in the classroom to be forgiving. We all make mistakes. It's a learning atmosphere, and this is the place to make mistakes and to be accommodating to one another and gentle with one another as we're doing that. And that seems to help, and it brings people out a bit more. And I think that's one tool that can be used immediately. And we have a set of resources available for all people at UBC in the classroom, and we're happy to share those as we go. But I think it's important just to deal outright with those emotions, the intense fear. That's the first step.
Yeah, I would add to that. I remember when I went to my first teaching job, I was, of course, teaching ancient English literature, so there was nothing too Indigenous about it. But I went to a few faculty meetings where some topics came up, and suddenly I found myself really quite in the thick of it, because it was impossible for me not to challenge some of the things people were saying. So I began talking about it. Well, I had not talked about any of these things professionally before. And in my family, my mother had gone to a residential school in the States. She never talked about it until she was over 90. So the pattern of not talking about it was very much a part of my life. And when I began talking about it, I was quite amazed at some of the things that crawled out of my mouth. You know, I really had no practice. And in a moment where I was responding to something, I said things in ways that I later looked at and went, well, I think I'm going to have to do a little bit better than that if I'm going to make any headway with people. And so I began working on it, and I began finding some people who seemed to have a better handle on it. And what they all told me was, yes, I look calm now, but when I was your age, you should have heard what I did. And that's just where we are culturally. And we can get beyond that. We can develop the language. We have language here to deal with so many areas of concern. We can put together something here. This is a very contested area. It's very difficult, but that should not daunt us. We have to do it. We have to find the language. We have to develop the discourse. And that's our role as professionals. And if we do not do it, who's going to do it for us? So we just have to do as Sheryl suggests, set the circumstances where we can do that and work towards it, and we'll get there.
So I'm just actually finishing my master's in public administration from the University of Victoria and working with Western economic diversification as a policy analyst. So even though my attendance today is as a policy analyst, I can't help but listen to the presentations with the hat of a student. And in that way, Corrine, what you said about with knowing nothing really resonated with me, because what I kind of took out of my studies in public policy and public administration was that as a graduate program, it's largely a generalist discipline, and that's kind of something that I've heard from faculty members and other colleagues within the field. So this is a question for both the students and the faculty, that as we congratulate the UBC for having a School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, I'm wondering what are some emerging critical theorists or theoretical approaches that you feel are influential to the School of Public Administration and Public Policy as a discipline that bridges academic and applied education? Okay. Sure, I made you take the last Well, thanks for coming from Victoria. So we had an interesting experience, a couple of us, Sarah, me, and 2 other students went to the policy competition of public administration programs and public policy programs that was held in Toronto last year. And one of the big things that I noticed that sort of addresses the theory question is that in public policy, the focus on audience seems to be much larger than it is in, or much wider, much more generalist than it is in public administration. And I think that's one of the things where we're building on that sort of theory. There's a lot of emphasis on how to communicate. How do you write one policy brief on one specific problem and then have it be for 5 different audiences? Instead of focusing on how am I going to write this for a bureaucratic setting in the provincial government, the municipal government, or the federal government. And that's one of the things that we've been working on in our classes is how do you write the same thing for 5 different people so that 5 different people understand it given their own experiences. So really focusing on the interdisciplinary. I think that's one of the big things that we're bringing to the table from a sort of scholarship approach perspective. And I think the other ones are really focusing on sort of how to deconstruct a problem. Problems like climate change are too big. You can't fix climate change as a policy person. You have to fix a specific thing within the existing structure that then has ripple effects that help address the larger problem of climate change. So having a deconstructionist approach and figuring out what exactly is the specific problem you are able to then provide the solution to. And Moira's design thinking is a big help in that. Being able to break down not just the solution, solutions are great, but figuring out what specifically is the problem you're working on. And that's something that we brought to the table at a number of our client-based projects in our capstone that people were really excited about and took away from. We really liked how you did this, how you narrowed down the problem we were addressing so that it was so much more specific so we could actually do something about it instead of keeping it wide. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for your question. I, as is probably obvious from my background, I'm not an academic. So you ask me about theories and I get very confused. So I'm not sure I have a theory for you. But I would say that I find it helpful to analyze the same problem from different perspectives, which is one of the things that I like about this program and definitely what we try to share with our students. So if you think of any sort of thorny global public policy issue, let's say it's the garment industry where you have a head office in Canada with a large supply chain throughout Asia, and we have, as we did a few years ago, a factory collapse in Bangladesh where many people died, and the labels of the Western brands were found in the rubble. You could analyze that from a legal perspective, you could analyze that from a human rights perspective, you could analyze that from a trade perspective. I don't know which one is, I don't think there's one that's better. It's just good to have all of the different perspectives because you could be an expert in a particular field and know all of the theories about your field, and that might not help you understand what's actually going on with that situation. So that's how I tend to approach things rather than thinking about theories, but that's because of my background.
Keskine, would you like to weigh in on that as a current student? Some of the materials you've been reading and find most influential?
Thank you. Actually, I would like to talk about Anne's course, right? Corporate Social Responsibility. This is an interdisciplinary course that we're doing with some of the MBA students, and that gives us different perspectives coming from their end. You know, as a policy student, you think differently from how an MBA student thinks. An MBA student is always concerned about the bottom line, right? But as a policy student, you think about the stakeholders. So that is one way that we're getting around it. And also with our capstone project, we have like a project in India, which is about rural development. something that borders on poverty, underground water, and a couple of other issues. It gives us that sort of direct experience working with a stakeholder. And I also believe that from the point of a global policy, a global change maker, theories do not solve problems. They only exist in the books for the academicians. But to be a global change maker, you have to go beyond academics to implement something. And I think that is, the takeaway of this whole program. That is a good part of it. Yeah.
I'm also wearing kind of different hats. I'm with the Brazilian consulate, but I've been at UBC for a long time. I did my PhD and then two postdocs. Anyway, so the one thing that I would say, and I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that interdisciplinarity is important, is that I had a very phenomenal experience here at UBC where I had just finished my PhD in political science in the political science department and then went right away to begin a postdoc in the forestry department because I was working with biofuels and then there was a project that was related to biofuels, but there. And I felt very dumb. It was very humbling from finishing a PhD thesis to being in an environment where I don't know what pyrolysis is. I have to Google it. And so, again, to say that the idea of interdisciplinarity is absolutely crucial for policy because it's very easy to get inside your own group with your own language, the jargon, everybody understands, but it doesn't translate into the real world. So the questions they would ask me from a policy perspective, almost like, what is the best solution? I'm like, well, it depends. Do you want the fastest? Do you want the one that's more socially equitable? Do you want it to be the cheapest? So it's this sort of engagement. But what I would say is just going back a little bit to the issue of Indigenous studies. What I first think is that Indigenous studies can be used even if you're not really dealing with Indigenous issues, but it can be used as a very strong pedagogical tool. And the reason is, I know that the program has a lot of international students. I'm from Brazil. And one of the things that really struck me when I moved to Vancouver 9 years ago was seeing all the people in the downtown east side, which for me didn't fit the idea that I had of Canada, and learning about all the problems with the Indigenous community. So that for me is, I think, is a very interesting way to kind of open up many of the things that we talk about policy to say it's complicated and show in a very tangible way, because what I found is that there's a lot of tendency here of people with very good heart, but to think, if we only bring awareness to the developing world, if we only bring the right policy to those people, things are going to work. And I always keep thinking, if it's that easy, why hasn't Canada already solved, those problems? Isn't it easy? Should Brazilians or Ghanaians come here and bring awareness to the problems of poverty or how to deal? So it's a tool for, I think, breaking away the myth that developed countries have everything sorted out. And it's also a tool for people who are born here, and again, who have very good intentions, but to get a better sense that it's not that easy to come up with a solution for a problem. And it's not because people are incompetent, or it's not because they're missing the perfect policy. It's just that things are complicated. So that would be, I think, my recommendation of how to introduce the idea of the Indigenous peoples and their issues, because it takes away that sort of myths of the perfection or the problematic world in those two streams, and everybody can relate to that sort of thing. It wasn't a question, but just an idea.
If I could just add something to that, I really appreciate your comment. We had a series of discussions at the Sauder School of Business several years ago about the introduction of Indigenous curriculum. And one of the points that some of the leadership at the school made at that time was that more than half of their students are international students. So learning about Indigenous communities in Canada was really not something that would be very valuable for them. And I think the argument we made was the one that you just made, was that one of the values of understanding it locally is that it's not simply understanding a particular circumstance. It's having a way to think about the complexity of a circumstance and the way in which our social systems operate to generate certain kinds of results that we can then begin to understand better. And that's something that people would, circumstance people would face wherever they went in the world. Those similar kinds of circumstances will exist in those places. Subsequent to that, the school began introducing Indigenous curriculum to all students in quite limited ways. But what they seem to have found is that students really valued the curriculum and learning about it partially because they were here and it was a way of understanding the place, but also because they could see the applicability to a wider range of circumstances. So I think, I think it's a really important point.
I'd like to add something just quickly to that. One of the things that this program does really well is it makes you reflect. And in our first year, there was a lot of reflection. So much reflection, because it was the first time the program had ever happened. And we as students were the only ones who'd ever been through the program, so we were the only ones who knew what it was like. When you speak about Indigenous issues, one of the things that really makes you think about is where you fit in a global sense. I'm a settler, and acknowledging that and being able to understand that that is one of the many hats that I wear that I can't take off, that is a perpetual one, is a big part of knowing when you enter any conversation about policy, you're never neutral. There is no objective answer. You're coming in with your own experiences, your own biases, and acknowledging them before you have the conversations is so important. And having a really interdisciplinary approach and having a really international cohort helps dramatically with that.
If I could just add something to that. I mentioned earlier the circumstance of coming in and working with a group of students who were quite opinionated. One of the circumstances with that, with those groups of students were that the first classes we had were almost paralytic because any idea that I introduced became the subject of these very fierce debates that all had to do with identity. That who could have an opinion, who could state something, who could make an observation, and who people felt couldn't. And it was really instructive. So what we did was we reorganized the curriculum to talk a little bit about what you were just describing, which is the sense of who everyone is in a particular conversation, and recognizing the non-neutrality of any position, but that recognizing one's position actually created the potential to be able to talk to someone else because that was recognized. And our program was evaluated about 6 or 7 years after it began operating. And what the evaluators said was that as the students talked about their work, they were all commenting on each other's work. And at this time in the history of that program, it had both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in it, as well as a range of different kinds of Indigenous people. The evaluators said students seemed very comfortable doing that, commenting on each other's work. And they'd never seen that before. So I think, again, it is quite possible to do these things, but it is necessary to be deliberate in thinking about what they are as problems and constructing a circumstance in which that's possible. And again, I'm so impressed that this is an observation for you that came out of your experience of this program. It makes me feel quite good that the program is doing something very valuable.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a second-year MPPGA student. I think I know most of you on the panel. My question is for Anne, and Anne, I want to thank you for sharing your experience because for this particular question I'm going to ask you to put your employer hat on and say what are the specific skills and assets from an employer's perspective that you see, you know, when somebody has a Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs on their CV that jump out at you? What are those things that this particular program offers employers? And Corrine and Keskine, maybe you can comment on whether what Anne says aligns with your expectations of what you had or what you're going to get. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ability to write, ability to think, ability to communicate. I personally very much value employees who can think critically, but as I probably not so delicately hinted in my remarks, not everybody does value that. There are institutions that have a philosophy, and if you don't have that philosophy, you're not really welcome, and your career will not advance, and it won't be entirely clear to you maybe why, and it's because you don't fit the philosophy. So that's a reality that's out there. Although personally, as I said, I very much value someone who can ask the tough questions because it proves that they can think. The other qualities would be all the stuff we've already talked about today, pragmatic, sort of balancing pragmatic and creative, a realistic and innovative, not always an easy thing to do. Being a team player is really important. I always hated group projects in school, and I discovered to my horror that life is a group project when entering the workforce. So yes, and that's just a reality. Managing up as well as managing down, another unhappy reality. But communication, you know I'm right. Communication and empathy can get you through a lot of that, and just honesty and kind of knowing who you are and trying to figure out the other person's point of view, as Corrine was saying, is true. But in the policy realm, it's about being able to think and then communicate. That's about as simple as I can make it. Corrin, is that right?
Okay. So I'm really glad you asked this question, Lauren. So most of our cohort is out there engaging with the employment world in various senses. I think I would say like 90% of them are employed, so great for the program. Some of the observations that we're really close, so we talk all the time. So some of the observations we've made about the employment world and what it thinks about the MPPGA program, the clearest one is, what's public policy? Which is totally valid, because when we all started the program, we asked Moira and Brian and all our professors, what's public policy? Because the program was new and none of us knew. So understanding that there's public policy, like Keskine said, in every interaction between organizations and people. Whenever you have people in groups and rules and you have goals and you're trying to organize something to meet goals, that's policy. So articulating that to an employer is really key, because they don't know, and it's not their job to know what our program is. That's not their role. So being able to come into an interview and articulate every possible aspect of this program specifically for what the employer is looking for means that it's a lot more work to be a Master's of Public Policy and Global Affairs person looking for a job than it is to be an economist looking for a job, because everyone knows what economists do. So that's one of the challenges, but it also means that it's a huge advantage to be able to go in there and have the person not know what to expect from you. So you can really bring so many of your experiences to the table and say, oh, I've done this, and I've worked on this, and I've worked on this, and isn't that great? And like, oh, okay. So there's so much more you can bring to the table than they'll expect, because they don't know what to expect, which is a good thing, but a challenge.
Okay. I'll look at it from a political perspective. To be able to define the problem and also profess a solution makes you a good politician. And the ability to communicate same is also very necessary, right? You have to work in teams. You have to do all that my corporate social responsibility lecturer said. And I think it is very true. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Julie. I work for the federal government, and I'm a graduate of a Masters of Public Policy program at SFU. So I have a lot of respect for all the students who have gone through a program and know the rigors of that. My question pertains to influencing policy and becoming a global change maker in the face of perhaps skepticism, around certain views. I did my capstone research on childhood immunization and kind of the skepticism towards perhaps the medical practice and recommendations. So I recently had my first encounter with a profound climate change denier not that long ago. And it was kind of an awakening experience, not because I didn't believe that that was a possible viewpoint, but that I was encountering it for the first time. And it really brought to my mind this notion that I'm in a bit of a bubble, perhaps, living in Vancouver. And I think academia at times can be a bubble. And I also think that government can also be a bubble in and of itself. So my question to both the graduates of the program and students of the program and the faculty is, what skills within policy and perspectives and approaches do you hope to take to influence change, particularly around those kinds of wicked policy problems that can be much harder than others to grapple with?
For my background, I think I appreciate what you're talking about. You can do all the policy job, do all the research, and one policy maker, being the politician, will sit somewhere and go like, I don't believe in that. Then I guess, everything goes waste. And that is why I personally decided to be a politician. Maybe being a civil servant later, being all that I can be, and being a politician at the end of the day, I get a chance to make the decision. So if I understand all these things and it is brought before me, I'm able to make a good decision. Because trust me, in Africa it is very different. And another thing that might also help in this situation is also to create a critical masses, right? I think when there is an issue and a politician is refusing to agree on what you think is the right thing, educate the people. And politicians are always interested in the numbers. So when people are talking about it, they'll be whipped in line. And I think that is one major thing that everybody, for example, in Canada, people are so much particular about the environment. And that forces every politician to incorporate environmental sustainability in their campaign. And I think that is a much more profound and practical way to go.
So, great question. I think that the program provides a couple of specific tools to deal with situations like that. The first one is one I spoke about earlier with regards to communicating to multiple audiences. Just because someone has a perspective you don't agree with doesn't mean that it's not a valid perspective. It may not appear valid from your background as a critical thinker. You may totally disagree. Climate change is real. Oh my gosh, how can you think this? But the person has experiences that have led them to this conclusion. So I think critical thinking is something we all learn in graduate school, but critical listening is one of the most important skill sets. Figuring out what specifically in this person's life has caused them to have this perspective. And once you understand where they're coming from, with the anti-vaxxers specifically, it's fear. Fear that my kid will get autism, fear that my child might die if they have this shot. That's real. That's valid. There is no parent in the world that can't sympathize with that fear. And so understanding where it's coming from and not just saying, oh, you're wrong, therefore I'm not going to listen to you, is, I think, really important. And I think critical listening is something the program does a really good job providing us with.
Thank you so much for your question. It's a great one. I don't consider myself an expert in communication, so I don't know if I have anything terribly profound to add to what Corrine said. I think critical listening is a big part of it. But there's another part, which is follow the money on climate change denial, as an example. And I'm also not an expert on the internet, but there's probably a reason why certain bits of misinformation are more popular than other bits of actual information. And it's probably quite complicated, but money and funding of certain sites and certain types of research would be part of it. So yeah, I think critical listening is important and understanding other people's perspectives is important, but if there's a misinformation campaign, I would find out who's paying for it.
Well, I think questions are starting to wind down. I'm feeling the energy wind down, so I think this would be a good time to close off this panel session and move towards, I think a break is next. Is that more?
You are absolutely right.
Okay. Well, before the break is announced, I just want to take this moment to, again, thank and acknowledge all the contributions from each and every one of our panelists, student, alum, faculty, university-wide, and I hope you will join me in a round of applause for their contributions.
So yes, it's break time. We've got about 15 minutes or a little bit more to enjoy the sun, what's left of it. Before we hear some excellent closing remarks from Senator Wampauwu. So join us in the lobby. We're always looking for, it actually looks like the Post-it collection has grown. And Sam has been extremely prolific, hasn't he? It's like, whoa. So we'll have a great record of a fantastic panel discussion. I really want to thank all of you. I learned a lot, and there's things to act on, which is always a good way to come away from some of these sessions. So have a good break. We'll call you back in around 15. And we've got gifts. Okay. Well, I don't think we meant this to turn into kind of an endurance test, but so we, Senator Wu, we're happy to have you here and to have you provide some reflections from our discussions today, and just very much you have your eyes on the globe, and you always have had. And so we just thought you were the perfect person to bring our launch to a close. So welcome and thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Maura. Later in my speech, I'm going to talk about the attributes of a good public policy scholar and student, and endurance is one of them. So all of you take the prize for staying through the day. Let me start, of course, by congratulating UBC on the creation of the School of Public Policy, Director Maura Quayle. I want to acknowledge, of course, the great pedigree that SPP has, the history that led up to the creation of this school. And I'm very proud to say that I was a witness to some of that history. I played a very small role in teaching in the precursor program, I guess you would call it, the so-called MPPS, the MA Masters of Arts in Asia Pacific Policy Studies. And I want to give a nod to all of the individuals, professors, faculty, staff, who over the years invested in this idea to its creation today as a school. Professor Pittman Potter, of course, Professor Paul Evans, Professor Brian Jobe, Professor Yves Tibergen, and many, many others. That, of course, is a brief history of the SPP, and I'm not the authority on the history of the School of Public Policy, but it's only a brief history and a somewhat inaccurate one at that, in the sense that UBC has a much longer history of involvement in public policy and influence on public policy. We know very well, you only have to take a cursory look at any faculty lists on this campus to understand that professors and researchers in forestry, in medicine, in the Sauder School, in economics, and on and on and on it goes, have had substantial impact on the formulation and the implementation and execution of public policy over the years. And so SPP, the School of Public Policy, is really building on that very rich tradition. But it does kind of beg the question, I suppose, as to, why then do you need a School of Public Policy if There's this rich tradition of UBC and UBC professors already doing such substantial work and meaningful work in contributing to public policy, not just in Canada, but across the world. Well, that's a question that you've been deliberating today, and I'm sorry I couldn't attend all of the sessions, but I was here for some of the discussion on what should a public policy school of the future look like, and some of the sessions over the afternoon. And I think you are well on your way to answering that question. How then can the School of Public Policy be different, can add value to what is already happening across campus, and in ways that go beyond subject matter expertise? That, of course, is a question not just for you as students and faculty and as administrators, but it's also a question for what in the jargon we call the receptor community. And I have recently, as you know, become a member of the receptor community. That is to say, the policy receptor community. It sounds very ominous, but all it means is we are the people who crave your ideas, who crave your input, who look to you for expertise and feedback and critique in order for us to do our work. As it turns out, my particular function in this long, convoluted chain of policy formulation is at the very back end, if you will. I kind of describe it as the very end of the sausage-making factory, which is probably the best part in a way, because you don't get to see, what goes into the sausage. You guys put the stuff in the sausage, by the way. But, at the same time, it's also very frustrating being a senator in the upper chamber, the last, in a sense, the last hurdle in the legislative process, taking a set of ideas that have already gone through a very substantial amount of sausage making. And while the Prime Minister, I think, is very sincere in saying that he wants a Senate with independent senators and a senator that is independent of the House, that is independent of the Prime Minister's office, that is independent of political caucuses, those of us who want to exercise our independence and to look at legislation with a critical eye, with a fresh set of perspectives, often find it challenging when we receive legislation that has already gone through the sausage mill, so to speak. There is, of course, only so much that we can do to change policy, not only from a practical point of view, because a lot of precedents and fait accompli have been put in place already, but there are also some constitutional issues, as you're all aware of. I'm not sure that Canadians would be very keen to have a Senate that takes policy and tosses the sausage back into the machine to start from scratch again. But all of this is simply to say that the role you play as students and faculty and players, actors in the policy-making process is so crucial for what I do. And I want to just stress to you that you have to think of public policy as a process. Let's give up on the sausage analogy once and for all, because it's too disgusting to think about. But it is a process, and the process is not linear. The process it has multiple goals and multiple ends, and public policy is not always the outcome of a particular part of the process even. And so the role that you play that is very different to the other subject matter experts in this university, the other policy players and practitioners on campus and in think tanks and elsewhere. Your uniqueness, your value added, I think, in part, is that you have an understanding of the process of policy making, of the different tools and the different skills that are needed at different parts of the process. And above all, you, I hope, will develop an understanding of how to make a difference at different parts of that long policy-making process. Which is why I think the tagline of the school is Global Changemaker? Yeah. Which is why I think the tagline is a very good one and should perhaps be the proximate focus of your time, I'm talking to students now, of your time here in the master's program. Public policy is really, in a sense, a lens or a set of lenses through which you will look at social or economic or cultural challenges. But change-making is the constant. Change-making is what you will do whether or not you effect the change in policy. And that really is kind of the point I'm trying to drive across. While many of you, certainly I, when I was younger and was thinking about doing policy, would always frame success as having actually changed policy. That happens very rarely, actually. I'm very fortunate into a position now where that is actually part of my job description. But for most of us, being involved in the work of public policy in the first instance is about change-making, and change-making is not always about changing policy. But that should not be seen as a failure, because change-making shapes the context and the process by which public policy eventually evolves. So how then might you distinguish yourself from subject matter experts, somebody with a master's in business administration or economics? There was some discussion about it here in the previous panel, and I don't have a definitive solution for you, but let me just give you some off the top of my head thoughts. The first is to have a public policy mindset. And I mean, that's kind of a tautology, I suppose, but to have a public policy mindset is fundamentally to believe that public policy matters. And it may be obvious to all of you here, but there are a lot of people who respond to problems and crises and difficulties in society without figuring that public policy has something to do with it, either as a positive solution or maybe as an obstacle, a negative constraint. I mean, take, for example, the debates we have in this city around real estate prices and agricultural land or vacant apartments or any number of issues that essentially boil down to the question of affordability. Often this debate is framed in terms of the particular actor acting in bad faith. The rich tycoon from country X that's bought a big house but spends all of his time in country Y. The speculator of apartments who has bought her fourth condo in Yaletown but only spends 2 months a year in that apartment. Often the debate, certainly in the media, is framed as the individual and that person's actions as essentially the source of the problem. When, of course, a public policy mindset to this problem will ask the obvious: what is the public policy context that allows these individuals? No, allows is not even the right word, because they are doing exactly what they should be doing in the circumstances that they are doing. What is the public policy context that makes this situation exist? And if we think it's a problem, what is the public policy solution to that issue? As opposed to, here's a culprit, there's a culprit, let's vilify this person, that person, or the other. So having a public policy mindset, I think, is going to be key to how you distinguish yourself from subject matter experts, and how, obviously, as was discussed in the previous panel, how you make yourself attractive to potential employers. A second point I would make, again, seemingly obvious, but increasingly under stress, is that facts matter. Alternative facts, I guess, also matter, but only if they really are facts. And this is not just kind of a curiosity that we joke about because our neighbors to the south have a very weird debate that's going on. It happens here as well, and I sad to say I see a lot of it in Ottawa, where there's increasingly a culture, or at least a tendency to, an over tendency to canvass many viewpoints and to accept every single one of them. Facts matter. Opinions also matter, but a policy mindset means you've got to make choices. That's I think the most difficult thing that certainly I'm learning now that I've moved from the world of abstract theorizing about public policy questions to actually making decisions. But it should be the same for you. As a master's student, as faculty and people who work in a school of public policy, you don't have the luxury of our economist friends down the road who can give you the on the one hand and on the other hand. Under certain conditions, the end solution would be this. That's a great economics way of describing a problem and providing a solution. You've got to make a choice. Or if you don't have to make a choice, you have to have a way of thinking that you can help your employer, your client, the responsible agency make that choice, and that ultimately requires a degree of courage. And I think a big theme of what your training here will involve is really building up courage. Courage to ask tough questions, to hear different views, but then ultimately to take positions that you have a conviction about. And then finally, one very important way in which you will be different from others who dabble in public policy is your toolbox. You are going to have a much bigger toolbox than the economist down the street, or the political scientist, or the anthropologist, or the doctor, and so on. But you're not going to be as expert on any of those tools. What you have to be expert in is knowing what tools you have in your toolbox and when to apply which ones. And you have to be idiosyncratic sometimes in applying those tools. Often you will turn to a tried and true cost-benefit analysis. You'll tally up the costs and the benefits, and you'll discount them, and you'll come up with a net present value that will give you the answer. But sometimes it may be survey data. Maybe it's participant observation. Maybe it's GIS data. And this is where exposure to colleagues in other faculties and departments, and Maura is working hard to pull people in from different parts of the university. That will be essential for you to build your toolbox and to build a way of understanding which tools to use for different solutions. If I might put it in a very simplistic way, other disciplines offer solutions, or at least they purport to offer solutions. You offer pathways. And your pathways sometimes lead directly to policy change. Other times they lead simply to changing the conditions that ultimately might result in a policy change. Let me finally just close on the second part of the degree designation, which is global affairs. That is so important to this program and so important to its pedigree, not only at UBC, a university in Vancouver on the edge, the western edge of North American continent, perched on the Pacific Ocean, looking at a region that is the most dynamic in all senses of the word, but one which will affect all of the streams of concentration and research and teaching that this program will focus on. When you think about development and social change, you cannot have a meaningful conversation about development and social change without understanding how the rise of Asia is redefining what that means. When you think about the Belt and Road, which we kind of often think, roll our eyes, the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is fundamentally redefining what development means. Now, in the West, infrastructure development was the only way of development back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. The Chinese and the Koreans and the Southeast Asians are rediscovering that with gusto. And so you cannot talk about development and social change without understanding how that there's a fundamental paradigm shift. I hate to use that cliche, but there's a fundamental shift in the way development thinking is evolving and how Canada fits in. On resources and energy and sustainability, same story. Where's the demand coming for resources? Where's the demand coming for energy? Where will the global sustainability challenge, whether it's specifically climate change or resource depletion, where will that question be answered? It will be answered in Asia, particularly in China. And once again, it's really important that this school draws on. And finally, of course, on global governance, it goes without saying that if before Donald Trump we were moving towards a multipolar world, we've moved much more quickly in that direction, and what happens in Asia is going to change the rules of global governance, the practices of global governance even more quickly. So you're just really lucky, we are all really lucky that UBC has such a reservoir of strength on all of these thematic areas, but particularly strength on the geographic knowledge, particularly the Asia Pacific, that apply to development and social change, that apply to the resources issue and to global governance. And I do hope that all of you take advantage of the expertise, the knowledge that is resident here at the LU, at the Institute of Asian Research, and much beyond across the university. I noticed Dean Gage is here, so I want to recognize him as well for his role in making this school possible, and the advocacy that I know he's been involved in, stressing its importance and its connection with the rest of the university. So it just leaves me to say that once again, as a member of the receptor community, I follow your work. I will follow your work very closely. I hope some of you will find your way to Ottawa. And my own office and my colleagues in the Senate, and I would assume in the House as well, are always looking for interns and short-term, long-term employees, and I hope UBC will keep us in mind. So good luck, congratulations, good luck, all the best, and look forward to good reports in the years to come.
Senator, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're so fortunate to have you as a friend.
Always. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good luck
Thank
to all of
you.
you.
Thank you. So this concludes the symposium portion of our event. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you're leaving with new contacts and that you've left us with some new thoughts about the policy school. Of course, these events just don't miraculously appear, and so it's time to thank, from the bottom of my heart, Lindsay Marsh, who has choreographed this launch, with the help, of course, of Aaron and a number of other staff from the new policy school. So thank you. So we are so pleased to have members of the Liu family with us today. So we'll now be hosting a tribute ceremony and plaque unveiling to recognize their father, Dr. J.J. Liu's immense contributions to the Liu Institute for Global Issues. And if you wish to say and join us in the lobby, please do. And so we move on into the lobby and to the next event. Thank you.